Thanks so much for inviting me here to talk. When I was at MIT, where I did my undergrad, I actually did a program sort of similar to BURECS. It was a lot of interdisciplinary work in science and communications, and actually it's what got me interested in journalism eventually, and it's partly why after I got my undergrad, I switched to journalism because I realized I didn't have the patience to be a scientist. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about my work and InsideClimate News. We are an online newsroom, so everything we publish is freely available on our website, which is right there. And this is just a screenshot from our website, I think from Friday or Thursday. But it gives you an idea of the types of stories that we cover on a daily basis. I've been a reporter there for almost 6 years. I was hired in January of 2011. And we, as you can tell by the name, we exclusively cover news that's related to climate. So climate, energy, environment, environmental health, anything like that. We are also a virtual newsroom, which means that everyone who works there, we're scattered all over the country, and we don't actually have a central newsroom where we all hang out. We also work from many different time zones. So I have colleagues in San Diego, we have a few people in New York and DC and Maine, and our top editor is actually in Israel. So she works very odd hours. And the nice thing about having a virtual newsroom is that we can cover events in different parts of the world. And right now we have about a dozen reporters and editors in total. But that still means that we're quite a small newsroom. So we don't see ourselves as trying to compete with the New York Times or the Washington Post or any of the big newsrooms, because we simply can't cover every single piece of news related to energy and the environment. Instead, we see ourselves as supplementing the mainstream coverage because we're able and willing to cover things that the mainstream media isn't really covering. And so once or twice a year, we'll put out a big investigation and go really deep into just a couple of topics. And that's, we have the freedom to do that because we're a small newsroom, and also because we're a nonprofit. And so being a nonprofit means we don't rely on advertisements to fund our work, the way that the New York Times does. And our funding comes primarily from various foundations. So they give us a set amount of money, and then we can just report on whatever we want to. We, as a newsroom, we use the same journalism standards, methods, and ethics as traditional mainstream media, but we are able to sort of be more flexible in what we choose to cover. And in the past, there have been years where we basically have covered just 3 or 4 topics and ignored everything else because we wanted to go deep into a few things. So this slide shows some of the big stories that we've covered. And every time we publish a big investigation, we package it as a Kindle ebook that you can get on Amazon. So just to give you some examples, on the top left is a series we did a couple years ago called Big Oil and Bad Air, and that was about air pollution from oil and gas drilling in South Texas. So we spent about 1.5 years on that project, continuously putting out stories. Some were very long investigations, some were just short follow-ups. And it was all about environmental health and the various inadequate policies and regulations and enforcement happening in Texas. Another ebook was Keystone and Beyond, written by one of my editors. That was published a couple years ago when Obama was still trying to decide if Keystone XL was in the national interest, and it kind of just put the pipeline project in the context of climate change. The one in the middle, Meltdown, is about a group of hikers who went to northern Canada and ended up having a really terrifying encounter with a polar bear. One of them was almost eaten by the polar bear. And so it's basically the only sort of thriller that we've ever published. When you read it, it reads like an adventure book. And interspersed with the action is facts about the science of the Arctic and how the ecosystem is crumbling because of the impacts of climate change. Bloomberg's Hidden Legacy was written a while back, and it's about former Mayor Bloomberg's plans to make New York City more sustainable and adapt to climate change, especially after Superstorm Sandy. And then the Dilbit Disaster was about the big oil spill in Michigan back in 2010, and the type of oil that spilled from the Canadian tar sands was a type of oil that we didn't know how to clean up. And that's a series that won us the Pulitzer in national reporting. And winning that Pulitzer was actually really great for all of InsideClimate News because it put our name out there and a lot more people were aware of who we are, and a lot more people started reading us, and it also eventually got us more funding and we were able to hire more people. So right now we have about a dozen people on staff and we're twice as big as we were back when we reported the Dilbit disaster. So reporting on climate change in the US is kind of a strange thing because as a country, we're special. And we're special because only about half of the US population believes in the science of climate change. And this is a pretty low percentage compared to, most of the rest of the world. And that just means that if you're reporting on this issue in the US, it's more controversial and more complicated than it would be in almost any other country. And this chart shows the result of an online poll that was conducted 2 years ago, asking, to what extent do you agree or disagree climate change is largely the result of human activity? And so the green bar is the percentage of people who agree, red is disagree, and the gray is don't know. So as you can see, the US is at the very bottom. Great Britain, Australia are also not doing so well. This next slide is just a very short history of climate science. And really the main point is that we've sort of known about how CO2 changes atmospheric chemistry for more than 100 years. That the first clues came way back in 1861. And by the year 1960, we had really good data from Hawaii showing that CO2 concentrations were increasing year after year. And 1965, which is, way before I was born and way before many of you here were born, is the first time that a US president expressed public concern about climate change. He didn't use that term, but he said in a speech that there was concern about fossil fuels emissions of CO2. 1988 is basically when the US public first understood the seriousness of climate change, and it was brought to public attention largely because scientist James Hansen testified before Congress. And in his testimony, he said, climate change is happening, here's what it is, here's how it works, it's a problem, and we need to do something about it. And he made that testimony in the middle of a drought and a really hot summer in Washington, D.C. So it added extra effect to the words he was using, and the public started to become aware of climate change. That was also the year that the IPCC was created, so scientists from around the world could start to collaborate on climate research. And then you'll notice 1 year later is when the Global Climate Coalition was formed. And that group was formed by a group of oil industry people and also interests from the manufacturing sector. And their goal was to delay and prevent any kind of climate legislation or any policies that would limit greenhouse gas emissions. And so the GCC is one of the earliest examples of the organized interests, ways of trying to delay and prevent climate policy. So there are a lot of names for the people and groups behind this effort. There's one term that's been used a lot, and it was coined in a 2013 study from Drexel University, which is the Climate Change Counter Movement. And that study counted 91 organizations with an annual income of $900 million. Not all of that goes towards climate counter movement activities, but it's clearly still a very well-funded group of people. And these are just some quotes from the study itself and from the study author, right? That it's a deliberate and organized effort, and that these groups increasingly seem to be trying to hide the sources of their funding. So there are groups out there that act to funnel money from funders towards these interests. So, you know, if I'm an oil company that wants to fund some sort of climate counter-movement stuff, I can put my money to one of these groups. And one example is Donors Trust, and then they will hide my identity and then put that money towards whatever group I want. And because of this kind of dark money practice, it's sometimes really difficult to know who is funding these activities. This here is an example of a memo that was created as part of this effort. It was written by the American Petroleum Institute in 1998 and leaked to the New York Times. And these are, you know, exact words from the memo. It's pretty famous because the opening text says victory will be achieved, you know, when stuff happens. In this case, they wanted to emphasize the uncertainty in climate science, and they wanted people who supported the Kyoto Climate Treaty to look like they were out of touch with reality. And, you know, this is a big example of how this counter movement was taking regular scientific uncertainty and making it into something bigger than it was, to say that, to try and chip away at the scientific consensus of global warming. And one of the impacts of the counter movement has been that it has become an increasingly partisan issue. So these are some graphs from a story we did recently. And on the left, you can see that campaign financing and political donations from the fossil fuel industry has become increasingly partisan, that they're giving more and more to GOP candidates and less, percentage-wise, to Democrats. And so the chart starts in 1990 and ends at 2016, you know, and you can just, it's continuously veering off. And on the right is a poll about asking people whether they believe in anthropogenic climate change. And you can also see over time that Democrats are increasingly more likely to believe the science, whereas Republicans are less likely. And that just reflects the increasing partisan divide. You know, and over the years, the counter movement's plans, a lot of their efforts have paid off for them. They have delayed and prevented a lot of potential climate action. There's been the increased polarization politically, and the effects have been studied and documented in many peer-reviewed papers, investigative news articles, and books. So these are just some of the major works that have been done. Justin Farrell from Yale University did a couple of really big papers last year sort of documenting how corporate money has influenced this climate misinformation campaign over time. And then many of you have probably heard of the book Merchants of Doubt that was written a while back and turned into a documentary. And one of the other effects was that this counter movement was successful in confusing certain members of the media. And you know, a lot of reporters don't have a science background. So, you know, if they don't really understand the details of the climate science, it can be easier for them to, you know, listen to the climate scientists on one side and then see people on the other side saying, you know, this science is all wrong, and then they end up writing stories that have a false balance, equating the misinformation with the actual science. And it certainly didn't happen to every reporter. There are plenty of great reporters who were never fooled by the misinformation, but there were enough that were swayed by it that it has contributed to some of the public confusion and perception of the science. And this is something that we're very aware of at Inside Climate News, and from the beginning, you know, we've based all of our reporting on the sound science. And so if we're writing about climate change, we're not going to interview a climate skeptic to provide balance. You know, that's not how it works. We will interview them when we write a story that is relevant, when we're writing about things like lobbying and campaign finance and certain studies that they funded and stuff. But if it's just the science, then they're not a voice in our story. So, for example, this is just a straight up climate science story we did a few months ago. One of my colleagues did an infographic on the many temperature records that were being broken this year, and how it's part of the overall warming trend. So in this one, she interviewed a bunch of climate scientists, got data from federal agencies, and that was it. A different example is a story we did last year about this scientist at Harvard-Smithsonian named Willie Soon, who's for many years has published research that says climate change is not happening, or that if it is happening, it's not caused by human activity. And documents came to light showing that his research had been funded by Exxon Mobil and a electric utility company and other industry interests. So this was a story about how his research is funded, so of course we wrote about it. And we tried to interview him, but he didn't talk to us. Another thing about climate change in the US is that a lot of climate scientists face harassment personally and professionally. And one of my colleagues actually spent a while reporting this as a beat, interviewing a lot of climate scientists and listening to stories about what they've had to go through just to do their research. So this was written in 2012, and back then she found that the US is the only nation where they face organized harassment. And in England and Australia and Canada, there is also harassment of climate scientists, but to a lesser extent. And then, unfortunately, just last year, she wrote a follow-up story, and things have not gotten better. If anything, they might be worse. And this is an example of a Facebook message that was left for a climate scientist. And my colleagues spent a long time gathering examples of hate mail that scientists have gotten. This is pretty bad, but it's one of the messages that we were allowed to publish. Some scientists gave us messages that were even worse and that they asked to be off the record. So there is even worse stuff that we didn't publish that scientists have to deal with. And for some of the worst cases, there was one scientist who told us she sometimes gets 200 hate mail messages a day. So it's just another layer of complication that people have to deal with. And coming back to Exxon, Exxon's role in the counter movement has been well documented by the news media and various peer-reviewed research and all of that. So it's been publicly known for a long time that ExxonMobil was a founder of the Global Climate Coalition. Actually, back then it was just Exxon. They didn't become ExxonMobil until about 10 years later. Exxon has written and funded many op-eds and advertisements, hammering the doubt on climate science. And they played a pretty large role in convincing the White House to pull the US out of the Kyoto Protocol. And then one of their lobbyists, Randy Randall, successfully got 3 federal climate scientists to leave the White House. He basically wrote a letter to the George W. Bush White House saying, these scientists have been working for the federal government for a while. They were here during the Clinton-Gore years. They're holdovers from that administration, and we don't think they should be working here. And stuff happened, and all 3 scientists ended up leaving the White House. So these are concrete things that Exxon has done over the years that have been reported. And this is sort of where things were when we started looking into Exxon for our story. This is a graphic from our first story. The story came about in a convoluted way. Back in the fall of 2014, my boss, the InsideClimate publisher, his name is David Sassoon, and he went to a journalism conference, and one of the speakers there was Daniel Ellsberg, who's the whistleblower who leaked the Pentagon Papers during the Vietnam War. And Ellsberg was there, and basically he was telling the reporters in the room that they shouldn't wait for whistleblowers to come to them, and that reporters should be out there looking for whistleblowers. And his theory was that there are plenty of people out there who want to become whistleblowers, but they just need a little push. And so my boss came home from the conference, and he started thinking about how we could do that in our work. And so at the beginning of 2015, we had a staff retreat. It's like the one time per year when all of us see each other in person in the same room at the same place. So we had a retreat, and we were going around the table sharing ideas of stories we wanted to report in the coming year. And David was so excited. He was just kind of wiggling around in his seat, and when it was his turn, he said, "I want to know when the oil industry first learned about climate change. What did they know, and when did they find out, and what did they do once they figured it out?" And then he just ordered us to go ahead and report it. So, I mean, we thought he was out of his mind because it seemed like an impossible story. We had no idea where to start. We didn't know, we didn't have deep contacts in the oil industry. We didn't know what company to start with. But a couple of my colleagues were given the time to just kind of explore and do whatever they could, and they eventually zeroed in on Exxon. So one of my colleagues, David Hassmeyer, he talked to a retired federal scientist who mentioned that he had worked with Exxon scientists researching climate change in the 80s. And then another colleague, Neela Banerjee, she found an old document about a climate change conference held in Washington, D.C. in 1977. And every person who attended the meeting was from the government or a university, except for one guy from Exxon back then. So between her and David, they figured out that Exxon was the company to follow. And so they followed that name from the federal document and discovered that scientist was deceased. But from that name, it led them to 2 names, and then 2 names led to 3 names, and eventually following that thread, Neela ended up obtaining 2 boxes of internal Exxon documents from the 70s and 80s. And these were internal documents showing Exxon's decade-long record on climate change research. And what we found was that they were doing really good research back in the late 70s and early to mid 80s. And the basic story we eventually showed was that once upon a time, Exxon was at the forefront of climate research. And then sometime in the late 1980s, they turned around, something in the company changed, and they migrated to the leading edge of climate denial. So that is the basic story we published. We released the story last fall, and the first chapter basically summarized our main findings. And the interesting thing was that Exxon, had very, very smart scientists working for them. And they recognized early on that the scientific community was starting to study climate change seriously. And these Exxon scientists realized that if the impacts of climate change were as serious as the scientists were saying it was, then it posed an existential threat to Exxon's business, right? That at some point down the line, the government was going to start restricting greenhouse gas emissions, and that would be a problem for Exxon. So Exxon's reaction was that they wanted a seat at the table whenever those regulations happened, because they wanted to help influence the direction of those regulations. And the only way they could be credible enough to have that influence was if they conducted really good, rigorous research. And that is one of the reasons why they created a unit of people to study climate science, and they gave them a lot of funding. It was about, I think, $1 million, which was a lot of money back then. And this interest in climate change went all the way to the top of the company. One of the documents we got was a memo from a scientist named James Black, and he mentioned in the memo that in July of 1977, he had given a presentation on climate change to Exxon's management committee. And the management committee is the group of people who are the very top level executives. And one of the things he told them was, there is general scientific agreement that the most likely manner in which mankind is influencing the global climate is through carbon dioxide released from the burning of fossil fuels. So he was saying that in 1977. And then the following year, he gave a talk to other colleagues at Exxon in which he said that a change in climate would mean changing rainfall patterns and agriculture. And he said some countries would benefit, but others would have their agricultural output reduced or destroyed. So way back then, the company was aware of many of the implications of climate change. This next slide is also from the documents, and it shows the path that one of Exxon's oil tankers took. And Exxon put instruments on this oil tanker to take samples of CO2 concentrations from the oceans and the atmospheres. So you can see that sort of diagonal black line, the Esso Atlantic route. The Esso Atlantic was the name of their oil tanker. And they did this sampling survey together with scientists from Columbia University and also with help from federal scientists. So it was a major undertaking for them. And what they were trying to do was to get better data to reduce some of the legitimate scientific uncertainties that existed. Scientists were trying to quantify the ocean's role in absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere, and this was one way that they could figure that out. This next slide is one of the graphics from our story, and it just shows the different kinds of, it basically shows what Exxon understood about climate science. And in the various letters and memos, they discussed what rising CO2 would mean. And they were smart enough to recognize that it would change precipitation patterns, that it would have impacts on human health, and that someday it would increase human migration and sea level rise. So it shows a very sophisticated understanding of climate change. And we even found some letters from Exxon's senior vice presidents writing to their scientists and debating very detailed scientific facts about climate change. So we know that some of the upper management were so interested in the science that they were basically having conversations about it through letters. Another part of Exxon's research was that they did their own climate modeling. And they hired several university scientists to help them do the modeling. There was one guy from NYU and someone else from Harvard University. So their own models in 1982 confirmed the scientific consensus of the time. And then ironically, many years later, Exxon's chairman would publicly mock climate models. And he said, climate models are unreliable, you can't depend on them for predicting the future. So he was basically making fun of the science that his own scientists had done decades earlier. This is another document that we published. And it's basically a letter from one manager to another Exxon manager discussing the far future implications of climate change. And at one point he says, that by the year 2030, the observable effects could be catastrophic. And what he says, will later produce effects which will indeed be catastrophic, at least for a substantial fraction of the world's population. So it was pretty stunning to see them use that word way back in 1981. Another part of our story was about this natural gas field in Indonesia that Exxon bought in 1980. And the company had the rights to develop the field and sell the natural gas. But because of the chemistry of that particular field, they realized they couldn't extract the natural gas without also releasing a ton of CO2 into the air. And they calculated that the CO2 would make this gas field become the world's largest single point source of carbon dioxide. And that would be really bad PR for them. So they were so worried about it that they spent at least a decade asking their scientists to figure out ways to get rid of the CO2. And they were coming up with all kinds of plans like, can we pump the CO2 into the deep ocean? Can we pipe it somewhere else? Can we do something chemically so that we can get the natural gas without releasing the CO2? And in the end, they couldn't come up with a solution. So Exxon actually abandoned the field and never developed the gas. They still own the rights to this field, and they could develop it someday, but right now they seem to have abandoned development completely. And so it's an example of where the company was so concerned about atmospheric CO2 that they gave up on one of their business projects. And finally, the last story in our series kind of put everything in context and reminded people that the type of work Exxon was doing in the 70s and 80s was very different from their public stance on climate change starting in the 1990s or so. And so these are just various quotes from, on the left, various quotes from Exxon's big climate research days, and on the right, various climate misinformation quotes from PR people and managers. When we published this story last fall, we weren't sure what kind of reaction we would get. Personally, I thought that a lot of environmental groups would read the story, and then maybe some people would write blog posts, and I really wasn't thinking any further than that. But it's gotten a lot more impact than we could ever have imagined. Last November, the New York Attorney General's office launched an investigation. It's focused on Exxon's climate disclosures to their shareholders. And then the Massachusetts AG has started a similar investigation. Just 2 weeks or so ago, the SEC launched an investigation similarly on climate disclosures and finance. And then the environmental community has rallied around this Exxon new hashtag campaign. They really want the DOJ to do an investigation, and they've been pushing for various groups to divest from Exxon, including trying to get the American Geophysical Union to stop accepting Exxon funds. And the interesting thing is that the Exxon new hashtag came from InsideClimate News. We had created the hashtag when we published our first story because we wanted a hashtag that people could use to discuss our story. We thought it would just refer to our series of articles, and pretty soon it took on a life of its own and became something totally different. So it's an interesting example of how something you start on social media turns out to be something completely different that we could never have imagined. And then finally, there's been a lot of people comparing Exxon's actions to what the tobacco industry did. And I think there may be some similarities, but the biggest difference is that the tobacco industry had done research on the health effects of tobacco, but suppressed the research. They never published it, they never shared it publicly. Whereas Exxon in the 70s and 80s were doing climate research publicly in collaboration with the government. And the thing was, people simply forgot about that research after it was done. So Exxon wasn't suppressing their research, they just sort of left it abandoned, and no one thought about it or talked about it until we wrote our series. And of course, we've gotten pushback to our stories as well. ExxonMobil has said our series uses cherry-picked evidence. They've complained a lot about it, but they can't find a single fact that's wrong, so we're okay. Lamar Smith, who's chairman of the House Science Committee, has subpoenaed the New York and Massachusetts Attorney Generals. He basically wants to investigate their investigations of Exxon. He also recently subpoenaed the SEC, and he subpoenaed a bunch of environmental groups as well. So there's constant letters and sort of verbal battles going back and forth on that front. And one of my colleagues is covering that as every development comes out, so we'll have to see what happens. About a month after we published our series last year, the Los Angeles Times, working with students at Columbia Journalism School, published their own series about Exxon. And it was funny because I had no idea they were working on another series. And so the two teams of reporters never interacted, we never worked together or collaborated in any way. But we ended up putting out two separate series that said similar things. And in their case, they used public documents from archives. And their story was more about how Exxon in the 1990s was publicly disparaging climate science, but at the same time incorporating climate science into their own business planning. So as they built up plans for drilling in the Arctic, they would put equations in to say, how will climate change affect our operations? So that's been interesting to follow their series. And Exxon, as you can imagine, is unhappy about that series and has written letters of complaint to Columbia University, and of course the Dean of Columbia has responded, so it's been interesting watching that back and forth as well. And finally, at InsideClimate, we have worked on a lot of follow-up stories. We've posted some additional documents. One of my colleagues wrote a story about the API Climate Task Force, which was a group of people from oil and gas companies in the 80s who met regularly to keep track of the ongoing climate research being done at universities and the government. Exxon was a part of this group, and it appears that Exxon was the only oil company that did its own original climate research, but these other oil company members, including Amoco, BP, and Shell, and I think one of the predecessors of Chevron, they were tracking the research, they just weren't doing any on their own. And then the bullet point about SEAL documents, there's an environmental group that gave us a bunch of documents they found online in archives, and out of it was a document showing that the American Petroleum Institute had known about climate change since the 1960s, and that was due to a consultant's report that was written for API. So again, that story just pushes the timeline further back on what the oil industry knew. And then we have other stories that are continuing that we're working on, and hopefully we'll get them out in the next few months or so. So that's it. Thanks.